The world's writers will walk through those gates, and if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
I hope you enjoy your events in this year's digital programme and that they spark in you thoughts and conversations and feelings. All the things that a good book should do and all the things that a wonderful book festival like Edinburgh International Book Festival does too. It's a book festival that's really dear to my heart. It's one of the first festivals I attended as a new author. I was part of their Outriders Africa programme, and every year returning to it feels a little bit like coming back to a literary home. It's such a pleasure to see them going online this year, and I'm so excited for the future of Edinburgh International Book Festival.
Hello, and a very special welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival 2020. My name is J.G. Ying. I'm a poet and critic based here in Edinburgh, and I'm delighted today to be chairing this very special live event with Billy-Ray Belcourt and Mary Jean Chan, Words Will Set You Free. The theme of this event as part of the festival is the power of poetry, so it's clearly fitting for us today to have two brilliant global poets whose words are indeed powerful, disruptive, and radical. Through their writing, they explore the limits of language, liberation, and love. These are books which, to paraphrase Kafka, become the axe for the frozen seas within us. And I don't know about the readers watching at home, but certainly of late, I have felt that we could all do with a little bit more warmth and comfort. So welcome to a virtual Edinburgh, Billy-Ray and Mary Jean. I'm glad you could join us, even if you can't be here in body. So before I introduce you both, before we hear you read a little from your books in turn, I just want to quickly remind everyone watching at home that we will have some time to take questions near the end of this event. So please do write and send them through the chat, and we can get to them later. But to begin proper, I want to first introduce Billy-Ray's book, NDN Coping Mechanisms, Notes from the Field, published from House of Anansi in 2019. Billy-Ray Belcourt is a writer and scholar from the Driftpile Cree Nation. He won the 2018 Griffin Poetry Prize for his debut collection, This Wound is a World, making him the youngest ever winner of that prestigious prize. That book was also a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. His second book of poetry, NDN Coping Mechanisms, was longlisted for Canada Reads 2020, and his debut essay collection, A History of My Brief Body, has also just been very recently published, which is really exciting. Congratulations. A recipient of a prestigious Rhodes Scholarship and an Inspire Award, Belcourt is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia. And to talk about the book for just a little bit, perhaps it's a bit embarrassing to bring up, but Belcourt was once described as one of Canada's poetry sweethearts, yet NDN Coping Mechanisms is more like a sweet bread. This book is rich, fleshy, cheeky, campy. These pages pulse with an almost organic and erotic energy. You could try to devour these lines, but who knows what you might transform into. And in a sort of stunning hallucinatory vein, we witness, for example, lovers turn into bison, a wall clock catches fire from neglect, a village is emptied of all its children. We are transported into those gaps, wounds, and the afterlife of Indigenous land. These experimental poems speak back to history's catastrophes, as well as the colonial violence and the grief enacted and enforced now. But make no mistake, this is a really darkly funny book. Revenge is more decolonial than justice, writes Belcourt. And these poems are not afraid to take aim at the hypocrisy of institutions, at the academy, by turning the theory back onto itself and then inside out, scrutinizing a lexicon of anthropology, those words which ensnare just as much as they make free. So Billy-Ray, a huge welcome to the festival firstly. Would you be so kind to read from us this amazing book? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay. That was a lovely brief vignette about the book. And to all the folks at the festival, thank you so much for having me. I'm reading from my home in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So here goes. NDN Brothers. Loneliness finds me drunk in an old Billy-Ray Belcourt poem. What's important is that wherever I am, my brother is perched on my right cheekbone. We are 24 and already too old for our own good. Last night felt like our last night. They always do. This is what makes night nightly in an amnestic nation against the literature of treason. Behind the wheel of a car without headlights, the night is a lukewarm mouth we sing into. In other words, where the heterogeneity of grief meets the singularity of death is the NDN experience. Today, the Ministry of Historical Ignorance didn't keep me and my brother safe. With its extra-legal powers, the ministry brought us to our knees so as to clog our throats with polluted language. In defiance, we licked the walls dirty in a house of administered subjectivity. Don't blame us. Our last hope, a fever, is sunlight breaking apart inside the skull. A lover's discourse. A boy in love with a boy becomes an open window. In every account of my adolescence, I hurled myself out of prison so that moonlight could tiptoe inside. The captive jutted out of me like music. Explanation. Homos, like poems, like city streets, are self-degrading. The sex drive and the death drive are one and the same. In the forest of men, shame dripped from my mouth a kind of honey. When I was licked clean and left with nothing, I made something lifelike in a kingdom with my cursed brethren. My lover traded in his horns for citizenship. We were grateful to be more than a cliff-bound herd of buffalo. Alas, we couldn't drink from the same river twice, but we kept at it, knee-deep in saliva. In our dying days, I stood on his shoulders to tug at low-level rain clouds. With a butter knife, I sculpted us a paranoid's paradise, a discovery. Even God's roof is bullet-holed. What to an NDN is the intrinsic goodness of mankind? I bottle up my feelings. In my serrated hands, the bottle shatters, and still I am not free. What is freedom to a man with shards of glass moving through him? I want to write as though the sentence were a set of limbs to be puppeteered. With which words will I undertake this work of choreography? I dabbled in documentary poetics, but my sexual practices made me anti-systemological. I filmed every inconsequential second of my queer life and called it experimental cinema. When no one was looking, I invented post-structuralism. Who but an NDN would know that some days truth is a ghost who shouts in the voice of no one in particular, and other days it is a secret nostalgia poured into the coffee cups of the living. Apropos of everything, what to an NDN is the intrinsic goodness of mankind? Maybe justice is a lover who regurgitates the English language so it comes back sweeter. Canada, why are your elevators filled with mud water? And what is it about a palm that makes a country feel like a garden? I dug and dug. I pulled out a bouquet of skyscrapers. I kissed each window softly. Is this not what an NDN does in a poem? The wall clock caught fire from neglect. Yes, this is the bedroom I built to evoke the effect of an open-air church. Just once I wanted to be unhinged from sentimentality. Instead, I continue to aim my tongue at a mattress covered in moss soft as September. With each bite, I mutter, what an ugly, necessary monster I made of myself. I think it is midnight. The wall clock caught fire from neglect a long time ago. My grief crowbarred the door open. It is like a coffin, inviting a gaze in response to which it can't spit back a body. The landlord fastens a note to my forehead. Half existence is structurally akin to an apartment. He lays himself flat in the hallway like a welcome mat. A creature of habit, I dip my feet into the dirt of yet another man's chest. His exhales gunfire. I float to the ceiling, light scurrying from me like water in search of a resting place. I miss Billy-Ray Belcourt. I believed myself capable of holding onto a name I was wrong. A man called me beautiful tonight, so I started over once more. The old body still flickering beside me. Tomorrow I will watch a boy who looks like me walk into oncoming traffic. He will expect no one to stop, but everyone will. People love being alive so much they will force aliveness onto even a hypothesis of a man. I am a man, but only insofar as I spontaneously combust when the best possible world begins. So each night I make love the way one siphons gasoline from an abandoned car, as though I'm running out of time. Truth is, I want even less than this already puny life. Leonardo Dicaprio. My ex-boyfriend got measurably more attractive, and all I got was a dad bod. Leonardo Dicaprio has a dad bod, and for whatever reason, that is reassuring to me. Leonardo DiCaprio finally won an Oscar for his lead role in The Revenant. Leonardo DiCaprio was almost killed by a bear in said movie, but alas, he wasn't. I've yet to see The Revenant, but only because there ain't nothing special about a settler who defies death while NDNs drop like flies around him. Case in point, the Wikipedia page for The Revenant is organized into 10 sections, one of which is plot, the first line of which reads, and I quote, "In late 1823, Hugh Glass guides Andrew Henry's trappers through unorganized territory." Regardless of what Leonardo DiCaprio had to say at the Oscars about native resistance and climate change, white people see what they want. They feast on what's before them. Had this been a movie made by NDNs, that bear would have killed Leonardo DiCaprio in the first 10 minutes. And for the next 2 hours and 26 minutes, because this movie runs 2 hours and 36 minutes, there would have been no footage, just the sounds of NDNs organizing territory, whatever the fuck that means. NDN Homo Sonnet. An NDN is the ellipsis of a nation. Even in God's palm, a homo is a yearning the size of a world. Is an invisible spectacle a paradox? Is a good melancholia? Mathematically speaking, an NDN homo is a metaphysical conundrum. Put differently, I am a mother before all else. Maggie Nelson speculates that a mother is the archetypal Levinasian subject, which is to say my lover is two fingers pulling apart the mouth of a planet, He's a dancer. To him, my living is the sound of an emptying. When I die, it will still be autumn in my body. I trust he will dust my shadow off so as to watch it tingle in dusk's wild mane. I was a windswept eye from the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy-Ray. That was really powerful and wonderful. Our next poet is Mary Jean Chan. Her debut collection, Flèche, was published by Faber and Faber also in 2019. As well as being shortlisted for multiple literary prizes, including the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Seamus Heaney Centre First Collection Poetry Prize, Flèche won the 2019 Costa Book Award for Poetry, making her also the youngest ever recipient of this award. In 2018, Chan was chosen as the winner of the Poetry Society Jeffrey Dermer Prize. She was shortlisted for the Forward Prize in Best Single Poem category twice and received an Eric Gregory Award as well. In spring 2020, Chan was guest co-editor alongside Will Harris at the Poetry Review. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Chan currently lives in London and is a lecturer in creative writing at Oxford Brookes University. Flèche is a sensuous collection where every lingering word or image seems poised right up at the edge of a window. On one side of that glass, the book calls to arms all the various adolescent pains of growing up queer and racialized, all those expansive yet inclusive desires, by way of poignant poems which explore the body's vulnerability. Yet on the other side of this glass, the book defies conventional notions about language, language which Chan describes as a key under a plant which grows those beautiful ghosts. And through these ghosts, we glean, whether in wistful dreams or in conversations with family members no longer possible, an ever more fragile sense of reality, the ambiguous complexities that define Hong Kong and its legacy. Ultimately, Flèche is about love and grace, those stories inside us that deserve to be heard, stories that test the loyalty to one's mother country, to one's mother tongue, and to all that which a multilingual tongue has touched intimately and yearns to keep on touching. So welcome, Mary Jean, to the festival. We would love to hear some poems from you, please.
Thank you, Jay. That was a wonderful introduction, and so lovely to be on the virtual stage with Billy-Ray today and to get to hear some of your work as well, which is absolutely wonderful. I'll start with the title poem of Flèche, which is a prose sequence. So there are subsections, and each section is a mini prose poem in and of itself. Flèche. History. At the age of 13, I wielded a blade because I had a firm grip. I was in love with Shakespeare, and the school team needed an essayist. When my mother flew to Linz to watch me go 3-4 down against a former champion, she gripped the railing until her marriage ring was folded into flesh. Strategy. You never duel against the same person, even if it is the same person. On the piste, once the blades are tilted upwards to signify respect, you recalibrate to thwart their every move. She was disarmed by my tears, a timeout to breathe through the yellowing bruise on my pale yellow skin. Footwork. Changing into school uniform felt like cross-dressing. I took my time, removing mask, then chest protector, lingering at the breeches. The day I learned to lunge, I began to walk differently, saw distance as a kind of desire. Once, my blade's tip gently flicked her wrist. She said it was the perfect move. Parry riposte. My greatest weakness, the riposte. In the changing room, the girl I was about to duel said I smelled of bitter gourd. We were practicing the Flèche. Inevitably, I collided with her, a blur of entangled blades. I glimpsed her wry expression through our mask's steel mesh, her gleaming, smiling lips. Grip and point control. French or pistol grip. One offers stability, the other more room for surprise. Before I came out to the world, I asked myself, French or pistol grip? Now you say, you're a great lover. Thank years of hard work on point control. How 2 fingers maneuver the blade's tip, a flurry of sickle moons. A hurry of English. What isn't obvious because I intend to obfuscate. Oh, choose its own tail like a rabid dog. What does it say about me? This obsession written in a language I never chose. My desires dress themselves in a hurry of English to avoid my mother's gaze. How I typed Shakespeare, then homoeroticism plus Shakespeare into Google, over and over. My mother did not understand the difference between English words, so she let me be. A public history seeps into the body, the way tea leaves soak up the scent of a fridge. An odorless room is not necessarily without trauma. We must interrogate the walls. My skin is yellow because it must. Love is kind because it must. Admit it aloud. This next poem takes its title from a collection by Adrian Rich, which is called A Wild Patience Has Taken Me This Far. I am writing in the voice of my most hopeful self. Amnesia was my daily bread. Thank God for fan fiction, for it gets better, for poets audacious enough to mention the body. Do you know what camouflage looks like on a day-to-day basis? Checking the coast is clear before opening a single tab and multiple decoys on a screen. Surreptitiously reading Shakespeare, the scene where Cesario woos Olivia. Watching my parents' faces for a sign to hold a tidal wave back. A daily prayer for the strength to confess nothing at all times. One day, it becomes a choice to walk out of this life or to begin living mine. I left half of my language behind to escape my impeccable persona. How I wanted to perform a heroic act to gain acceptance into the kingdom of ordinary people. To love a city and to not have it love you back is its own form of torture. When I met a beautiful stranger for the first time, I was deeply afraid of her tenderness. An appointment with a therapist led to a second date. I was given permission, needed permission. She held my hand till I began to comprehend the territory of skin, its frantic heart and silent ponds. Most nights, I dream of my mother's face, by turns harsh and tender. In a nightmare, I shouted at her, "Neither you nor I are the enemy." What do mothers ask their own daughters everywhere in the world? Is there a question? Ask me something. Autobiography. My detractors think they know me, loud and always too soft-hearted. The time I purchased 50 pairs of frames from a sobbing woman whose eyewear shop was closing down. The day I lost my father and cried myself sick, until I thought I would never sing again, though music was my only love during the revolution. The time my daughter told me she was in love with a woman, and I lied and told her it would be okay. What does 3 years of famine teach a person? Nothing, except that there is such a thing as perpetual hunger, loss pounding on the windows like rain. Except that my father loved me, and that he came back as soon as he could, in the swallowtail butterfly that fluttered around the flat, in our pet papillon, in my beloved child. And I'll conclude with the opening poem in my collection. Thank you for listening. Always. Do you ever write about me? Mother, what do you think? You are always where I begin. Always the child who wanted to be a boy, so you could be spared by your mother-in-law. Always the ear that hears you translating my poems with a bilingual dictionary. Always the pen dreaming it could redeem the years you fled from, those red-guarded days and nightmares. Always the mind's eye tracing your frantic footsteps towards the grandfather I would never meet. Always the lips wishing they could kiss those mouths you would approve of. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jean, for that amazing reading. Thank you both so much. I guess to begin the discussion, I want to start at the beginning with the first word. The titles of both of your books, I think, are doing something that's quite interesting, quite playful. Billy-Ray, maybe you could speak a bit about sort of why you decided to use this acronym NDN, Indian, and how that sort of sets, I guess, the tone for the rest of your book.
So firstly, it was in reaction to how unliterary or unpoetic other alternatives sounded. So Indigenous, Native, these didn't quite marshal the rhythm of poetry that I wanted. Secondly, and as I note at the start of the book, NDN has two valences. Firstly, it's an acronym, as you mentioned, that isn't as popularly used, but I did see it being used in and around 2014, 2015. This was when a movement was unfolding in Canada called Idle No More, in response to the government's inaction around historical redress as it relates to Indigenous people and colonization in this country. And it is also internet shorthand. So it's the way that we Indigenous peoples talk to each other, refer to ourselves and one another on the internet, particularly on Twitter. And that to me was compelling for political and aesthetic reasons because it suggests a language that is not the language of the state. So we as Indigenous peoples have had many names thrust upon us. We have often been known by way of how governments and non-Native people have configured us. And so NDN seemed to me to be a small act of rebellion, of linguistic, philosophical rebellion, because it opened up space for us, a kind of subversive or covert space on the internet. And so I wanted to honor that as well.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. I think it is subversive because maybe for a reader who wasn't familiar with what it stood for, you go into the book, into the title, thinking it's a sort of maybe bureaucratic or sort of governmental acronym. Maybe, if you type in, as well as the sort of acronyms that you mentioned, NDN can also stand for sort of National Data Network or Next Door Neighbor or No Defect Noted, or all these sort of other acronyms found online. I want to move on to Mary Jean, and I know you sort of in your poems, in your beautiful reading, you touched upon sort of the title poem, Flèche, and that great sequence. But maybe you could explain a bit more about why fencing, and especially this sort of wordplay in the title, is so important for your book.
Thanks, Jay. Yes, so Flèche is, for those of you who might not be familiar, it's a French word that means arrow. But in my usage for the book, it's a fencing technique. So I learned the Flèche as a teenager, where you have to run at your opponent at high speed, and it's usually used as a surprise attack. So you don't use it that often. But I've always enjoyed its flamboyance, its kind of playfulness, as you mentioned. And I also obviously love the pun on the English word flesh, the flesh of the body. And I think when I was putting the book together, I was really aware of this duality of, on the one hand, wanting to be vulnerable, wanting to be sort of bared to the world, if you will. But on the other hand, there's this sense of defensiveness as a queer person who is trying to come out at the beginning of the book and then eventually attains a more kind of empowered stance, if you will, but it still is this conflictual stance of feeling like I needed to be safe or somehow make sure that I was safe from attack. And I think that the persona throughout the book grapples with that duality. So that word Flèche for me embodies both these things of that act of coming out, yet also wanting to be safe from the world's homophobia and racism as well. Because I'm a Hong Kong Chinese person living abroad. I've lived abroad for 10 years now in the US and then the UK. And one realizes that in seemingly safe queer spaces, there also can be racism and there can be other threats. Whereas back home, I am part of the racial majority. And so that threat sort of disappears and dissipates. But then there is the kind of anti-queer environment that is still prevalent in that part of the world. So yeah, for me, it was trying to bring those two things together pithily, but also in the wake of Brexit, I quite like that it's a French word. You know, it signals a sort of a Europeanness that maybe is a bit covert. And also the last thing, as a Chinese writer, I wanted the title to be non-racialized because I think there was this expectation, especially as an East Asian writer, that my title would contain something pertaining to China or Chineseness, which I didn't feel I needed to fulfill as an expectation. So that was another thought that went into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, your comment about the expectations of queer racialized writers, it's definitely something that is sort of haunts us, you know, it's sort of, we can't escape what people want from us, what people expect from us. And I guess that sort of brings onto this question of, you know, in both of your books, violence is a key theme, whether that's colonial, historic, racist, homophobic, internalized, you know, violence in various ways. How did you sort of balance writing about all these types of violence compared to the desire, the need to write about queer joy and longing, especially? How did you sort of navigate those tensions? Maybe Billy-Ray, you go first.
Sure. So as I was writing this book, two trials were unfolding in the Canadian courts. And these were the trials of Gerald Stanley and Raymond Cormier that had to do with the killings of Indigenous teens. From our perspective, Indigenous peoples, these were incredibly racialized, racist, colonial killings. And the court cases that unfurled from them were also incredibly racialized and racist and colonial. And no kind of legal justice was delivered. And I felt that the book had to not only respond to these particular trials, but also to lay bare the various ways that colonial subjugation continues to impede Indigenous livability and flourishing in Canada and North America more generally. And part of the project of rendering an ongoing violence for a racialized writer, in my opinion, has to do with the refusal of the kind of aesthetics that would correlate that experience of suffering with an inability to be joyous or to desire freedom or to care for one another despite or in contradistinction to that violence. And so one has to be very mindful about not simply operationalizing a kind of damage-based narrative. And so how I refuse to do that, and as you suggest, Jay, is by attending to not just the small acts of rebellion, but also the perhaps seemingly unliterary ways that we care for one another as Indigenous people, And so, for example, one of the examples I use is that of the space of the reserve being, for many years, a kind of open air prison where Indigenous peoples were relocated, to in the present being a place where we gather and feast and celebrate our indigeneity and care for one another in ways that, in my opinion, exceed the original carceral intent of the reserve. And so holding in the space of juxtaposition or contradiction, the violence and the joy is an incredibly pressing political act, I think.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I want to pick up on a word you said. You used aesthetics, and it made me think about this amazing poem in your book where the narrator is talking about a Canadian memorial site. And in your book, you seem very distrustful or rather skeptical about the government's ability to provide a sense of restorative or reparative justice. You talk about sort of this idea of public death, the social amnesia of forgetting. And, I can't help but think about this historical site, the Turn Spectacle, where you write, it's not enough, these politicians who pretend the red on their skin is sunlight, sort of, implicating that actually it's blood that's on their hands. Do you think, could you talk a bit more about your thoughts on this aesthetics of spectacle and trauma?
Totally. So since at least the 90s in Canada, we've seen a shift in liberal governance from inaction and neglect to a kind of historical recognition. And this has taken on the name of reconciliation. And so particularly in the 2010, that decade, we saw attempts by a few governments, both federal and provincial, to offer up some kind of redress. And there were monetary, there were 94 calls to action offered up by, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and, a model similar to what unfolded in South Africa post-apartheid. And though these, were good responses and went some way in terms of allowing those who survived the residential school system, for example, throughout the 20th century, to feel some kind of forgiveness or letting an ability to let go. As many scholars and writers have charted or pointed out, that a lot of that discourse suggested that what had happened was over with and that we were able to move on as a country, or that was a sad chapter that we could turn the page on. And so I think part of my poetic practice has been to reveal or bring into focus the ways that not only the violence of the 20th century endures, but is made anew and practiced again and again. And, new modes of colonial governmentality are operationalized to this day. And that I think there needs to be a more robust and ongoing refusal to further perpetuate the various myths of settlement and conquest that keep Indigenous people from, experiencing the kinds of freedom and flourishing that, we as a people desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. And, sort of staying on theme, but moving over to Mary Jean, I'm interested in the sort of linguistic violence that you talk about in your book, or made apparent by perhaps this, the difference between Chinese and English. You know, in your book, in Flèche, Mary Jean uses a lot of Chinese characters interspersed within, but yet at the same time, these intimate interpersonal experiences feel untranslatable. Both English and Chinese, to some extent, feel inadequate in closing that gap in meaning, sometimes that sort of violent gap and dissonance, rather. So I guess my question is, what's your relationship to language, to translation in this book?
Thanks, Jay. Maybe picking up on the few poems that actually have Chinese characters, I had a question recently at a different event I was doing where someone asked me why I decided to leave the Chinese characters unglossed. And my response is that, you know, it is actually, in my opinion, a way of giving both languages, both my languages, Chinese and English, an equal status in the poem. So English doesn't become the superior language that everything needs to be translated into. And I also wanted readers to kind of encounter what is normal to me, my language, in a way that perhaps would be unfamiliar to them, that they're not immediately able to access the meaning of those Chinese characters, but do they have other ways, other means of looking it up, perhaps, or asking a friend, or just having to work a little harder to access the meaning of those words? Because frankly speaking, as an ESL speaker, that was how I learned English growing up in Hong Kong. I had to, you know, learn vocabulary using a dictionary and a thesaurus, and that was how I acquired knowledge and meaning. So it was almost an invitation to the reader, in a slightly provocative manner, perhaps, to say, why don't you have a go at feeling perhaps slight discomfort, slight surprise that the poet won't do the work for you in this instance. In terms of my relationship, more broadly speaking, to language itself, I learned English at a time when you know, Hong Kong was still an English colony. I was born in 1990. We were handed back over to China in 1997. So there was a period where there was no question that English was the superior tongue or language. It was not articulated, but we knew it. And the school I went to was also an English language school, which is quite common in Hong Kong, where all subjects are taught in English except for Chinese language. And so there was always this pressure to acquire English quickly because that was associated with social and cultural capital. And even as children, you feel it, even if you can't articulate why. You know this is almost imperative to your survival as a student because it defines whether you're successful in that environment. And so I was always keen to acquire it, but then gradually it took on, I suppose, a more urgent meaning for myself because I was finding queer traces in English literature. So at a time when I wasn't having access to queer Chinese writers, I found, you know, Cesario, who I basically had a literary crush on in 12th Night, and was realizing that there were different ways of behaving and living in the world that were possible, but that were not possible in my mother tongue, because at the time I was still closeted. And so despite it being a kind of imposed language that I was supposed to acquire, I gradually fell in love with it, also through English poetry and Anglophone poetry. So I have a kind of complex relationship with English. It's the only language in which I write poetry. And perhaps there is a deeper kind of need to go back to excavate why I don't write poetry in Chinese, which is my mother tongue. But yes, I think it's a combination of history and politics, and also just my finding a safe haven in English that has resulted me in choosing English as my sort of literary language.
Do you think then, you know, if you weren't able to translate this book yourself into, say, Chinese, is that something that you would look forward to, the prospect of someone else translating it so it could be read wider?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose I have translated a few poems, but just privately for my mother, who doesn't read or speak English. A comment she made was that the poem sounded quite English, which was quite funny because she doesn't read English, but perhaps the syntax just didn't feel as natural, which might be testament to my poor translation skills. But I think just having it in a different language felt freeing when I was writing it, because I felt like it was my own space. I could write to a different audience. I could sort of have that sort of boundary between me and my family crystallize a bit more so that I could feel able to say certain things. But I think now, having had more distance from the book and having it actually be received well by my parents, I'm excited at the prospect of maybe translating it myself.
That sounds amazing, and we look forward to it. Before we move on to the questions, I want to briefly just ask Billy-Ray the same question about translation, especially, you know, what are your thoughts in terms of translating into Indigenous languages, especially this book and your other work?
Yeah, so unfortunately, few books are translated into Indigenous languages, mine being Cree. I definitely would welcome that, were that to happen. I don't speak Cree. I know bits and pieces of it, given that my grandparents spoke it, and they're who raised me, and I did a bit of learning on my own in university. So English, is also my literary language. It's also my, dominant language. And there is then a kind of, elegiac force or resonance that it is always already there in my use of the English language. It's the only language I have. But perhaps, and in my most optimistic moments, I think that there is something, again, defiant here in my, usage of it to reveal the brutalities of history into the present, how the language itself becomes an index of all those things. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think, regardless of language ability, we're all translating in a way into English. Within English is various Englishes, minor and major. It's not just a process of one language into another. So we do have some questions. Ken asks specifically to Billy-Ray, as a member of the Cree Drift Pirate Nation, a people that has suffered so much at the hands of colonial powers, how is it possible to find a sense of hope?
Yeah, a lot of my writing traces these enactments of hope, against all odds or in spite of, the violence enacted against us. And, it's precisely, in my opinion, this ability to muster hope that shows the impossibility of conquest or colonization to do once and for all what it seeks to do, which is, to fully stamp out our sovereignty, our, philosophies, our ways of being in the world that, predate colonization. And, anyone who has spent, any bit of time with Indigenous peoples or an Indigenous community, know that the story of, suffering is not the only one, that our resistance is more important than that story, because it shows that, we have a long-standing tradition of protest and care and love. And I think if that as a public, as a nation, if we can have that be the center of our around which the axis around which other ideas about Indigenous people orbit, then the narrative can shift, and it's already shifting and it has been shifting, but it can shift more profoundly in a direction that I think is for the betterment of all, not just Indigenous peoples, but the nation itself. Yeah, I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And Mary Jean, is there anything about hope that you want to add in terms of relation to your work at all?
I suppose for my book, there's that line that I read in that poem, "A Wild Patience Is Taking Me This Far," that some of these poems were written in difficult moments, but also written out of a sense of hope, that this moment won't last or that change is possible. I think the thing that threads the book together is my relationship with my mother. So whilst it's about kind of coming of age, kind of coming into oneself, it's also about a familial relationship that I hold very dear. And when that came under threat because of who I am, I needed to write poems that ended with perhaps like a word like grace or something about reaching towards a kind of reconciliation in the future tense. And thankfully, the book is behind me and that reconciliation has happened in my own life as well. So I suppose the book was also my way of reminding myself that this process would take time, but that it is also deeply possible. My mother's a writer as well, and I think somehow my being a writer and her writing in a different language, but writing to me as well, has helped us bridge that divide and to translate ourselves to one another so that we now understand each other better after that kind of tumultuous period. So yeah, I do think my book is a hopeful one.
Great, thank you. So sort of related actually, Jen is wondering to both of you, do you ever feel reluctant about sharing the intimate experiences that your poems address? How do you deal with a sort of, how much do you tell, and yeah. Mary Jean, maybe you could go first since, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose my reaction to that is that, whilst I suppose I give a lot of myself, if you will, in my poetry, there is also so much that is necessarily left out. And so many of these poems, I would argue, are deeply fictionalized, not in terms of their emotional truths, because obviously they're born from these deep-seated feelings and emotions and experiences, but a lot of these scenarios have been rendered in a way that actually is not a narrative or chronological sequence of events. It's not that happened and I've transcribed it into poetry. It's completely been filtered through, I suppose, the imagination and through language. And despite the difficulty of some of these moments, these poems were a joy to write. And maybe going back to our earlier discussion about queer joy, I find so much joy and so much solace in language. And so even in the kind of most painful moments that these poems might be offering to the reader, there is joy in how it's written, in how I am writing it, or expressing it in language. So yeah, I suppose it's a deeply curated thing for me. And the reader might be given the illusion that this is a huge divulging of family secrets, if you will, but actually it's been carefully selected and curated.
Yeah, similarly, there's this dance between fictionalization and autobiography that I think every poet is conducting. And having just written a memoir, I think that the poems allow for a degree of fortification that memoir does not. And there's an experience of having exposed oneself that I'm now experiencing with the memoir that I didn't to the same degree with the poems. Perhaps that is because, again, with why I write poetry, is again primarily because I have an adoration of language, and one of the main reasons I think to make art is to envision the future that we want to live in, and so poetry has been the domain for inside which I can do that, and I can watch others wield language rebelliously. And I hope too, as a queer racialized writer, that even if the poems aren't plainly autobiographical, that they gesture to, emotional truths, as you mentioned, Mary Jean, or common experiences or, feelings or affective states that can become little beacons for those like us to not just see themselves in the literature, but to see their lives and their experiences as worthy of artistic consideration.
And I think it's important to point out to the people watching that actually you're both doing quite interesting things with this idea of autobiography. You know, Mary Jean, many of your poems may be about your mother, but you're imagining things through your mother's perspective. You know, there is a distance that's still there. And similarly, Billy-Ray, when you were reading your poems, people may have picked up on, you know, you insert yourself. You talk about yourself in the third person, you break that fourth wall, you know, so there cannot be this idea of, you know, this is a simple autobiographical poem. Mm-hmm. David is asking us a question about sort of process, writing craft. How do you write? Do you write fast and furious after a dream, or do you revise tediously, or all of the above? And maybe Billy-Ray, you can tell us how you write these poems.
It's hard to say. I think there are moments that could be described as fast and furious, and I love that. I want a Hollywood film about, you know, poets, fast and furious poetry. But there, as we were mentioning in, you know, the talk before this talk, the not live one, that I haven't written many poems in the last year. And I, you know, particularly so during the pandemic, I haven't written much in any genre or form. And I think being the age that I am, I need to live more. And that is actually harder to do right now. We're not in the same rhythm of living that we've cultivated for ourselves. And, you know, we're in a different place right now, and we don't have the same poetic tools to understand that place yet, or we're just picking them up as we go. And so it's hard to say what my writing practice will look like into the future, the near future. But to this point, I have written pretty quickly. You know, my third book is out now, and, you know, I'm at work on the fourth, which is a short novel. And part of my, you know, quickness is because there is so literature by Indigenous peoples about the queer experience, and also from or about the place in which I grew up, Northern Alberta. And so, you know, I felt like there are a number of stories to tell about that place from a queer Indigenous perspective, or from an Indigenous perspective. And so that's why I have been galvanized up into this point.
In my case, I suppose the first book, because it's a debut collection, it is sort of all the material that I was gathering and working on up until this point. So that a lot of that did feel quite urgent, that I had to write these poems. I suppose there's some writers who talk about that one book that they had to write if they were to write anything else. And I think Flèche is that book for me. I needed to sort of discuss my relationship with my mother, to write about queerness, to really come out as a queer writer personally and on the page. And doing that has enabled me to, I think, write with a freeness, a freedom that I didn't feel initially when I was trying to write this book. I feel like I've kind of proven to myself that it is all right to be who you are. And the reception to the book, and how many queer people have told me that they've seen themselves in the book, that has meant the world to me. Because growing up, I wanted to read that book. I wanted to see myself reflected somewhere. And so if that book does something for someone, especially from my home, then that is just incredible. So right now I'm also in a bit of a dry spell, but hopefully that will be overcome soon.
and we can't wait to read more work from both of you. On that note, we have sadly run out of time. To end, I just want to say that both Flèche and NDN Coping Mechanisms can be bought at the festival's independent online bookshop, shop.edbookfest.co.uk. You all may have noticed that this year's festival program is free of charge for everyone and has been made possible by the generosity of our supporters and donors. If you have enjoyed this event, we'd love you to consider making a donation to the Edinburgh International Book Festival so they can continue their great work of putting on events for as many people as possible. Thank you to everyone who has helped with this event, the festival team, including all the programmers and all the technicians here in the assembly rooms who have made this run smoothly and, more importantly, safely. Thank you, the audience, for tuning and listening in, for your thoughts and questions. And of course, thank you most of all to Billy-Ray Belcourt and Mary Jean Chan for generously sharing your wonderful writing and words with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.